in the work that we've done in the past, of course, our collaboration with our colleagues and allies in Europe has always been very important. And it's good to see some of them here. We hope also that our colleagues from the Pacific, our colleagues from the Caribbean, this reconvergence around a broad agenda would be something that would find easy to carry forward. But the challenge is huge, because in a situation where the governments are not really up to speed in terms of where they are, the challenges are significant. So we have quite a bit of work. The ambitions for this meeting are great, but I'm sure that with all the experience that we bring, we'll be able to come to a successful conclusion in the next 2.5 days, so that we lay a very good foundation for the substantial work which lies ahead.
As you are aware, the post-Cotonou process is on. There is a draft agreement on the table, but as Yao has pointed out, so far not a lot has been done in our respective countries. As ATN, our work so far on the post-Cotonou has been a little bit ad hoc. We haven't yet really got into the grips of the issue. We haven't had a clear roadmap of what needs to be done. And for me, I think that should be what we need to do for this meeting, really charting out a clear way forward.
The idea for this meeting has been evolving since Brussels last year, when people got together from all over the world to say we need to get Cotonou on the table. But as the conversations went on, two things kept on constantly coming back. That post-Cotonou relationships is, on the one hand, both, a threat really, it's to put it mildly, a threat, and at the same time a challenge for us, an opportunity for us to reorganize. A threat because almost all the experiences that our countries and our people and civil society organizations have gone through for the past almost 20 years are likely to get bigger and much more potent and much more dangerous. Because we have been through 20 years of a relationship of Cotonou, which described as a partnership, but which we discovered very soon that it's a partnership of a different kind. A partnership, one side is unable to call any shots of its own, and the other side calls all the shots of itself. So we have had the EPA negotiations where we'll be going into details very soon, but we could see that what was supposed to be a good faith negotiations that create conditions for us and our people to realize the opportunities was not as quite what it was. We discovered very soon in the process that each side have their agenda, but unfortunately the side that we come from, the African, the Caribbean, the Pacific, did not quite define their agenda in a proactive way, and we were forced to play catch-up, and the catch-up that was not very good. Our civil society organizations were we actually managed to rise up to the task and provide a counter-narrative so that we could force both government officials, government agencies from the north in Europe and from the south in the ACP to reorganize their thought, and we came very far. The problem, though, is that we would have thought that the lessons of those imbalanced relationships would have been learned, right? Especially not simply for the fact that the negotiations were not the best, but also because, as you have mentioned, things have changed. And as the things changed, they exposed the limits of what the relationship was about. The global crisis rose and told people in the ACP that you cannot continue to have a trade relationship defined around aid and be getting people to just give you, ask you to open your markets to them as a way of development. African countries then got up and said they wanted to do their own CFTA as an agenda for themselves. But if you listen to what the Africans and their heads of state are about to adopt in Kigali, in fact today and tomorrow, you'll be a bit frightened. They didn't learn any lessons at all from their engagement with Europe. If you look at the so-called directives that the European Commission has put forward as the ways in which it is going to organize what it sees as the issues for the negotiations, you'll be asking yourself, has the European Commission and European member states learned anything at all from the 15 years of acrimonious negotiations? So my view is that if you listen to the officials, the governments from both sides, they are pretending as if even the way they fought each other and the disagreements they had, that has not made any difference. They are still, going the way, almost the same way that they went. The ACP countries will be meeting in May in Lomé to then adopt a memorandum of understanding. From what I know, they have already structured a negotiating team with countries from Chad and countries from Barbados to be negotiators, but they don't have a negotiating mandate. So there are people who are telling us who will negotiate what topic, but they don't know what they're going to negotiate about. And if we don't take it, they're likely to just do what they did last time, take the European Union's negotiating mandate, copy and paste, cut and paste, and change, where they say Europe, they put Africa, and where they said, they put this. So that's a danger, okay? Now, we cannot allow that danger to be repeated, because if that negotiating process repeats itself again, it will be worse, because we know that the situation of our people has become worse since the negotiations started and since the global crisis. So to go back and reproduce the same process and actually reinstall the same agenda and paradigms will not be good for us. Fortunately, it's also an opportunity, and this is a very delicate thing to say. We can say that civil society organizations have played a very critical role in the way the implementation of Cotonou went forward, right? But as you have pointed out, I think we're all exhausted. 15 years after shouting no to EPAs, and 15 years about doing stand-up, stir-up in the Caribbean, and 15 years about doing something else everywhere has left us all in fragmented ways. So even though we are still working our own ways, we are still not together as we would be. As Jane put it, the thinking that we have now about the EPAs is really at the very beginning. If the African, Caribbean countries and Pacific countries are late in formulating their vision, we as civil society organizations are even later in formulating our own concerns.
I think that the broad features of the global crisis everybody here will be very familiar with. We know that it started essentially as a financial crisis. At the heart of the global financial system, which is the United States, the overextension of all manner of financial players, but especially banks, insurance companies, mortgage companies, and other non-bank financial institutions, their involvement in the subprime mortgage crisis is what actually began to trigger a widespread crisis. One of the biggest companies that was involved heavily in issuing both these securities, as well as trading in those securities on its own behalf, as well as on behalf of its rich variety of clients, other financial houses, governments, and so on and so forth, was the famous Lehman Brothers. In the summer of 2008, when it became clear that many of the holders of the mortgage had begun to default, the whole edifice of this whole financial engineering began to crumble. And the scale of this had come after a series of shocks to the financial system from late 2007, which were not necessarily widely public, but had necessitated a state of affairs where by the time of Lehman Brothers, because of its scale of involvement, the US financial authorities thought that we should pull the rug. Except that when the US authorities refused to bail out Lehman Brothers, it set a cascading effect which swept through the whole financial world. Now, it's important to understand that when such a thing occurs, the structure of the economy which is doing the exporting can actually increase your vulnerability and calls forth the necessity of either breaking with the pattern of policies that you have pursued up to date, or trying to do something to rejig your economic relations or your economic structure or the sources of your growth. You have to try and find some way to diversify. So this, broadly speaking, speaks to a policy orientation of stimulus, of bailout, of domestic support, which privileges the fact that the demand that is constituted by domestic economic consumption is your surest way to rely on to navigate your way out of a global recession, is also your surest way to ensure that you minimize the volatility and the shocks that are associated to the financial channels as well. So in a sense, it stands to reason that you go this way. Except that when we look at the record of the ACP regions, I have to say they were operating according to an entirely different logic and drew entirely different conclusions, which up until today, they have failed to explain either to themselves and certainly to the rest of us. But the point about it is that the ACP regions seem to have a kind of almost unanimous policy response. It's important to stress this unanimity because there was actually very little formal coordination across the ACP regions. That by the time that the crisis broke out in 2007, 2008, many of these countries, because of the boom in commodity prices and so on, and because of the fact that they themselves were beginning to enter into a phase of financial liberalization to add on to the trade liberalization that they had engaged in an earlier phase, they recognized that you need to have some kind of insurance, that you are opening yourself up to volatile flows back and forth which can destabilize your economy, and therefore you have to have some rainy day money somewhere. So many of them have actually built up huge unprecedented levels of external reserves. Okay, so Africa, for example, I think 9.4% of all African GDP was held as reserves in the United States. I mean, that's a huge amount of money not to invest in your own country, to keep in somebody's assets which is paying very little or nothing in terms of interest earnings, whilst you are borrowing in your own country 20%, 30%, 40%. The cost of money and the opportunity cost of investment in your own economy is so high, these countries felt that the most important thing was their export dependency and that their economies would grow that way. They did not privilege domestic economic actors as the ones that will bail them out of this particular situation or even take them forward into the future on the basis of a new economic strategy. We have to recognize the structural constraints that these economies face. Nonetheless, structural constraint or not, policy choices continue to be made. And in a period when the breakdown of the neoliberal order seemed to offer the possibility of at least beginning to carve space for alternatives, it is regrettable, highly regrettable, that actually the choices that were made took us back even more deeply and meshed us even more deeply into the neoliberal order. In just projecting from the ACP experience to where we go from here, we find that the number of things that have changed includes the fact that the deeper penetration of global finance, including mobilizing domestic resources like pensions which are being privatized and so on and so forth, is actually intensifying. If we juxtapose those trends side by side with some of what has been happening in global trade, you recognize that actually we have created a ground and a momentum that allows many of these more aggressive powers to feel that they will gain some mileage by pursuing those type of policies. And we have not created either a policy framework for alternatives or clustered the alliances and brought together the interests that will begin to form a bedrock for an alternative way of actually doing things.
Now, the Central African region consists of 6 countries, and only Cameroon has ratified the Economic Partnership Agreement. And Cameroon is considered as the country that has betrayed the region. So Cameroon signed its interim agreement in 2009 and ratified in 2014 by the parliament. And unlike in the Caribbean region, we took to the streets so many times. I mean, in Yaoundé, we had to organize protest marches where we brought together civil society from the other countries of the region. In front of the European Commission, who was meeting with the head of state at the time, to put pressure and say, if you do not ratify, I'm sorry, the 11th EDF won't come to you. Cameroon ratified its EPAs one day before the end of the parliamentary session when all the parliamentarians were literally asleep. When the negotiators were forced to sign an interim agreement that says the EU EPAs agreement between the EU and Central Africa, whereas it's only Cameroon that has ratified. So that's already messed up. It's already messed up the fact that the EU does not even respect its own engagement. When the clauses clearly says these are supposed to be regional agreements, and you go pick one power or one country and ratify, and then you tell the negotiators, oh, that's fine, we can keep it at that. The name is okay. It is EU and Central Africa. We are trying to negotiate with the other countries, and in the next months, we are talking about 2014, 4 years later. In the next months, the other countries will join your EPAs. As I speak, the other countries are not joining Cameroon's EPAs. They have literally refused to join Cameroon's EPAs. Implementation started on August 1st, 4th of 2016. The EU told us that it's going to help, of course, reduce poverty, right? But the fact that today only the bigger names and the bigger organizations and the bigger multinationals are benefiting from the liberalization process, and there is no implications, no impact, nothing on the poor consumer. When this meeting came up and we're talking about post-Cotonou, I have a question like, why would we want to hold on to a partner? Maybe I want to sound like a couple thing now. Hold on to a partner who cheats on us, who is unfaithful, who is mistrustworthy. I mean, as for me, if I have a partner like that, I leave the next day. With all the lessons we have learned, with all the things we have seen, with the way the EU has treated us in these negotiations, why do we even want to think of another agreement or try to negotiate another agreement with the EU?
The East African Community, we are comprised of 6 member states: Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. The latest country that has joined us is Southern Sudan. But when we were negotiating the EPAs, Southern Sudan had not yet joined. When we started negotiating the EPAs, on the 16th of October 2014, EU threatened to review the Market Access Regulation 1528/2007, which would have made Kenya to start its exports to the EU to start attracting tariffs. So on the 16th of October 2014, in order to salvage such economies, the negotiations were concluded for the EPAs on the EAC side. I want to raise one important issue, that negotiations were concluded not because the parties were fully in terms and agreement with the provision therein. Negotiations were concluded because of the pressure that was always mounting, that was all mounted to the EAC partner states, especially from the EU. Now, look at the year when the EPA was, when negotiations ended, 2014-15. 60% of the EAC budget was financed by the EU, but we are negotiating with the EU. The legally scrubbed text was scheduled to be signed in 2016, July, but Tanzania pulled out, saying, hey, this agreement is not favoring my industrialization. Tanzania has a mini Asian tiger plan where it looks at becoming a mini Asian tiger by 2020. And Tanzania, the EPA would not help it achieve this. So out of the blue, Tanzania pulls out and negotiation signing collapses. The status of the negotiations of this EPA so far in the East African Community, we have Kenya and Rwanda, which have signed. That was on 1st September, which signed. Kenya has gone ahead on the 20th of September to ratify the EPA text. Then we have Burundi, which has not yet signed, not because it is against the content, but because it is under EU sanctions. At the same time, we have Uganda, which is also has not yet signed, not because it is against the content, but because it would like East African Community to sign the EPA as a bloc. So what are these key concerns that the ESC has in the EPA? We have the question of industrial development. The EPA, of course, has really serious provisions which constrain our ability to be able to graduate into industrial economies. Looking at the liberation schedules, looking at the level of products that have been covered. It also has issues of denunciation process. In other words, does not allow for some countries to pull out of the EPA. There is no committed funding for the implementation of the EPA. And then there is one critical concern, that in an event no accepted way is reached, then the countries will use variable geometry principle to implement the EPA. variable geometry has worked well in internal regional integration to accelerate regional integration internally among partner states. Variable geometry has been good. It works, with of course some challenges, but bringing variable geometry to implement an accord with third parties, there's no way that has been proven. But also for ESC, which is a common market, which has a common external tariff, if the countries were to, if Kenya, Rwanda, maybe if Uganda also come on board, if they were to implement the EPA and Tanzania is out, then that would be the beginning of the crumbling or the beginning of disintegration of the ESC bloc. Kate noticed that one of the first objectives of the EPA was to promote regional integration. So this will be taking me to the experiences. The experiences have been that in the event of negotiations at the ESC level, there have been contradictions regarding what the EU promised and what has been delivered, what has been the realities on the ground.
So the cultural and creative industries, I think you know, are among the fastest growing sectors in the world. And as we transition from a goods-based economy to a service-based economy, cultural and creative industries are big for us. And for the Caribbean economies, it's a way to deal with our size. So there's a lot of focus on this on the part of the people of the Caribbean, although our governments have not really given the kind of attention I think it needs. So the cultural provision turns up in two separate categories. The market access provisions for entertainment services. This would enable CARIFORUM artists and cultural professions. I don't know if you recognize that CARIFORUM is the Caribbean countries plus Dominican Republic. Yeah? So that's the difference. So it will provide access now to 26 European countries. That was the idea. And here for commercial presence. While the cultural cooperation provisions, this was embodied in the protocol on the cultural cooperation that set the framework for cooperation, for cultural exchange, and for non-commercial activities, all with the exception of the audiovisual sector, which they've dealt with specifically, and I'll come back to that. So the market access commitments sought to create new openings for the Caribbean service providers, to give companies a legal certainty, to be more transparent, and the possibility of CARICOM entertainment businesses to set up an agency that could provide services to the EU and to increase temporary presence. Now, with respect to the cultural cooperation, this protocol on cultural cooperation aimed to improve the trade in cultural goods and services and redress the structural imbalance and asymmetries. That's important because that's really now the developmental issue that everybody wants to tackle. So there's a lot of excitement about this. It enabled artists and cultural practitioners to enter the EU, to collaborate on projects, training, technology exchange, etc. The bilateral cooperation on all fronts, the audiovisual sector requiring co-production treaties. And that is something very special that I'll say more about in a while. But this protocol deals with the non-commercial transactions. And what was significant is that it was the first protocol that put Article 16 of the UNESCO Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions into practice. The significance of these provisions is that with respect to the market access, this is the first time that the EU and member states made significant market access commitments for entertainment services. The protocol provided access to the EU audiovisual market for co-production, and the whole arrangement with respect to how to enter the markets was seen as significant because it effectively qualifies Caribbean, the co-production arrangement as a European work, and therefore would satisfy content and quota requirements for EU member states. So this was significant as long as they had this balance of 20% for the Caribbean, 80% for Europe. So this formula was seen by our negotiating team as a very generous provision on the part of the EU. So the protocol was seen as more than a mere cultural cooperation. It really was, together with the market access, seen as the strategy for economic diversification and development. And so it was seen as precedent setting, and the first trade agreement that made reference to this convention, all of that made it quite special. In fact, the European Commission referred to the protocol as a showcase of implementation of the UNESCO Convention and as a model for future engagements. The R&M Director General saw the protocol as a historic concession, and David Jessup, the Director of Caribbean Council, thought it was the most innovative part of the whole 1,000 plus texts that we signed. So there's a lot of riding on it, and quite frankly, it was seen as the provision that made EPA saleable to a lot of grassroots persons, because the governments have not traditionally paid a lot of attention, and the people of the Caribbean really want more attention. So that made it very saleable. So what happened? Well, first of all, the access to EU was frustrated by a range of issues dealing with the Schengen visas. Only 9 Caribbean countries have visa waivers out of 15. There's a tendency only to provide a single entry, and that usually takes time, and so it's been very frustrating. And it's worse for countries, CARICOM countries, that doesn't have any consular representation. So you either have to go to another country or you have to send your visa, and of course all of that takes time. There's an EU-funded study in 2014 that actually pointed to trade missions that had difficulties, and there are 2 examples of them, and they literally were not able to be part of the tour because of these difficulties. And the study also found that trade officials traveling on official diplomatic passports from Caribbean countries to attend meetings in Europe also had difficulties. Granted single entry visa, and it expires quickly, and it creates difficulties.
When we're tracking SDG, WTO, post-Cotonou, the kinds of instruments we have to track. SDGs are non-binding, they're still voluntary, but when you look at SDG 14, the key things that we have to track. One is on fisheries subsidies, which the binding instrument is the WTO, but it is introduced under the SDGs. The second indicator to look at under the SDGs, it's around ocean acidification. And when you're looking at it from just a purely climatic system, the role that oceans play is probably much more significant than land and territorial forest and what they play. So in terms of absorption of carbon, acting as a carbon sink, production of oceans, current movements to keep our Earth alive and people alive is attached to this thing called oceans, which is not referenced in the climate and climate process. The Pacific made the mistake in Rio. We introduced this idea of blue economy because we wanted to make it sexy, because we wanted to sell the idea of blue economy. Blue economy now has a very descriptive, clear purpose. The most clearest purpose comes from the European Union, followed by China. If you look at post-Cotonou discussions, it's identified as one of the key sectors for investment and private sector development. Specifically, and at least in the interest of PACPs, fisheries. Again, I'm not going to talk about that. But the new one, which is around access to extractive sectors, including seabed mining, and then, put in these nice words about taking into account sustainability concerns. Who defines sustainability? The experience at the regional level, Pacific specifically, is that the European funded a project in 2009. It was a very discreet, in fact, very small, but 3.4 million euros to set up legislative frameworks in the Pacific on seabed mining. Highly problematic legislative framework, which simply signals that the region is now ready because we now have these legal instruments around seabed mining. So I just wanted to flag that again as some of the key things, but again, paying particular attention to the question of political coordination and what does it mean.
Now, the issues that have emerged with regards to trade investment issues have been opposed by the ACP in a number of forums. And some are old issues that are very repackaged, nicely in some of the chapters, in the draft mandate. The first one that I came across was what they call investment facilitation. Very, very innocuous. Investment facilitation, you find it in the draft mandate of the EU. We have the issues of services, government procurement, intellectual property, you find them. You have the issue of micro, small, and medium enterprises. And then we also have to cooperate on competition policies, including transparency as regards public subsidies and all that. There's the issue of electronic commerce, and then there's a bit of a financial inclusion. And they talk about the whole spectrum of financial services and innovative finances that we need to agree on. Now, let's take a look at the inside the EU mandate. If you take that document, there's a section on investment and private sector development. And this is what the document says. The parties will foster the development of an attractive and stable environment for investment by supporting stable, transparent, and open rules for investors, investment flows, the transfer of capital, technologies, and exchange of information. You also find the parties who support the rules of micro, small, medium-sized, what we call MESMES, as crucial enablers of inclusive growth as well as sustainable development, and then to enhance financial inclusion. At the multilateral level, I thought it was very important for us to look at the reconfiguration of membership on these issues. In some forums, you have some countries supporting these. In some forums, you have only the EU. In some areas, the EU is able to get some other countries to join. The main proponents over the years have been developed countries. But at the last ministerial in Buenos Aires, Argentina, we had a number of developing countries also joining the fray. So, for instance, Nigeria is a member to the working group, on e-commerce and investment facilitation. You have Liberia, Benin, and Togo also in the investment facilitation group, and also have Kenya in the informal working group on MESMES. We need to ask ourselves why these countries are joining these. Do they understand the dynamics in these issues? So we did. Simply because the Africa group at the multilateral level actually rejected all these issues. And you have some of the members sneaking to join these groups. What does the EU mean by investment facilitation? To be able to understand exactly what the EU means, you need to look at the proposals that the EU is tabling in all these forums, whether it is at the WTO, whether it is under the rendezvous clause in the EPAS, whether it's in the post-Cotonou framework. You need to exactly what the EU means. And when you look at the proposals at the WTO or the FTAs, you have something like, we want to look at the administrative processes about investment, regulatory actions in relation to investment. The European Union said, look, we want to make sure that at the national level, we should be able to comment on a policy that you take as a sovereign nation so that it doesn't actually obstruct our investment flow.
Now, everybody thinks that Brexit is all about the UK and trade with the UK. It's not. The fact that the UK is leaving the EU will change the dynamics of how markets work in EU 27 countries, since it will remove the demand of the UK from the market equation in a context where the EU's obligations will remain the same. It will also impact on trade which goes through an EU 27 member state to the UK. So for example, if I Google search for Zambia and I want to trade horticulture products and I look for a shipping company, I find that those that are offering shipment to the UK do so by the Belgium airport of Liège for high-value horticultural products. That means they're flown to Belgium and then they are moved across a border to the UK, through the Channel ports. So this is another dimension of relationship to EU 27 countries which will be impacted. I've already mentioned that least developed countries will enjoy duty-free, quota-free access under a parallel EBA. Non-least developed countries, as I mentioned, fall under the EPAs. Now the EPAs consist of two components. They're reciprocal agreements. They cover the rights which African exporters have, which are obligations on the UK government to allow duty-free, quota-free imports. They also include the rights which UK exporters have to receive the tariff preferences which have been set out in the EPAs, and, importantly, the non-tariff preferences as well. Now, when the UK leaves the EU, the EPAs will no longer apply to your exports to the UK, and, importantly, UK exports to your markets. This is particularly important in South Africa, where the UK has major export interests, totaling around €3 billion a year.
The UK's basic plan is completely to mirror the EU's trade policy towards ACP countries. So to replicate all the EPAs with this kind of UK version, and also to replicate the preference scheme. So the three tiers of the preference scheme, the everything but arms, but it's also committed basically to replicating GSP Plus, including the political conditionalities and the standard GSP scheme. There's two pieces of legislation going through the UK Parliament at the moment to facilitate this process. So there's a trade bill, which will give the UK powers to bring through these replicated EU deals. And there's a customs bill going through the Parliament, which will grant the UK the powers to set our tariffs and set up basically our new preference scheme. These two pieces of legislation are proving very controversial because how the UK is trying to do them is with absolutely zero parliamentary scrutiny. So part of the fight that we have in the UK at the moment is to try and make sure that parliamentarians get a say in what the new trade policy will look like. And in the immediate term, what we've been arguing for is for the UK to offer continuity of market access for ACP countries, but to be more flexible or creative about the mechanism through which that market access is delivered. So not just to default to replicating economic partnership agreements, and to look at where the space is within the preference schemes to offer improvements. So moving on a bit more to the politics, there is a window of opportunity, and it's the next 2 years. And I think for a number of reasons which I'll go through, the ACP are in a position of relative, if not considerable, negotiating strength during this period, and I'll explain why. So first of all, there isn't the rush that the UK government thought there was. Nothing has to be in place by March 2019 when we actually officially leave because of the terms of the transition deal. So the UK will definitely have to provide ACP countries with existing levels of market access during that implementation period. And we need to look quite closely at what UK agriculture policy will look like once the UK is out of the cap. So how is the UK going to subsidise British farmers? How are we going to support their export? There's not much happening on that yet, but it's something that we're trying to get our heads around. There's a consultation paper on future UK agriculture policy. Parliament in the UK is also starting to wake up to the problems of the economic partnership agreements. And this isn't just the Labour Party. So Tradecraft and the allies we've been working with in the UK, we've been working really hard to get cross-party interest and understanding of what the problems of the economic partnership agreements have been. And the Trade Committee itself recently did a report where they made a very clear recommendation on EPAs. I was slightly disappointed because I think they could have been more ambitious. But they also said the government should bring forward proposals for a mechanism whereby rolled over EPAs will be subject to a review in respect of issues such as, and here is where they have heard our lobbying, most favoured nation clauses, rules of origin, the requirements for liberalisation, SPS issues, with a view to potential renegotiation in due course. Now, as Paul said, I don't think that anybody should be holding any store on the idea that there would be a renegotiation ever. I don't think that's the direction we should be going in. Once these agreements, rolled over agreements, are agreed, that will be it. There will be no political incentive to relook at them any time.
We're almost in 2020, and the Cotonou Agreement was signed in 2000. So there's many years that have passed in the meantime, and the European Union has changed. One of the things that has changed is that in 2000 there were only 50 member states, and now we have 28. Most of the member states that joined after 2000 are Central and Eastern European. They have no affinity with the ACP. But when they joined, they had no choice than to accept what is called the acquis communautaire. So whatever the EU has already achieved and established has to be accepted by the new members as such. They cannot change it, they have to accept it. For instance, they had to accept that they too had to contribute to the European Development Fund, and they too had to open their markets for ACP countries and so on. And they continue to say, especially Bulgaria and Romania, that they are much poorer than many ACP countries. Their gross national product is around $7,000, and many of, for instance, the Caribbean countries are a lot richer than that. Also in Africa, you have countries that are richer than that, so they keep on nagging about that. But now, the agreement has to be renegotiated, and now these countries can say, now it has to be adapted to our situation and to our realities. And that means they're not prepared to give much favors. They want an agreement between equals, which is also what the Commission is saying. Another change is the EU feels insecure. We have a lot of conflicts in our neighborhood, including also between us and Russia, Ukraine and so, then of course the Middle East, Northern Africa. What also has changed is some of the main documents that the EU is referring to. The EU adopted in June 2016, and this went completely unnoticed because just a few days prior to that, there was Brexit referendum. But the EU adopted a new strategy, EU global strategy, where it looked at the instability in the region, terrorism, refugee crisis. It saw geopolitical shifts in the world with Russia, with the Chinese, and so forth, and so the fusion of power. And it felt it needed a new foreign policy strategy that would use all kinds of instruments, not just diplomacy, but also military intervention here, the aid there, migration policies, that had to be more restricted, energy policy to secure essential European interests, trade policy and so forth. So all that is in the global strategy. All these instruments, aid is also seen as an instrument of foreign policy, has to make sure that we can intervene, for instance, to tackle the root causes of migration in Africa. EU also adopted very recently a new EU consensus on development. EU aid must lead to returns to the EU. That's how China helps developing countries, that's how we also should do it. We should support developing countries so that our companies can go there and make their business. In any case, whatever it is, any successor agreement or 3 successor agreements, they must always be based on EU values and interest. It must be a partnership between equals, and it must have added value for the EU.
We spent quite a bit of time at the beginning discussing the level of commitment to the ACP as a group and whether this was the right basis for a future relationship and kind of challenging that a little bit. Most people did see a value in the construct and in the political relationship and saw the ACP as an important grouping, particularly for maximising South-South trade and investment, and that increasingly it could move towards something that was independent from the EU as opposed to, coming from that history. In terms of the kind of relationship we would like to see post-Cotonou, the key principles were equal partnership, respect, rights and obligations on both sides, clear mechanisms for enforcement of those rights and obligations, and that the purpose of the relationship should be clear in that it's to support autonomous development and to exit from aid dependency. So although we didn't feel that you could completely remove aid from the equation, we wanted to suggest the direction of travel was away from that dependency. Then in terms of what's in and what's out, a concern and something that should be resisted was the deep intrusion and challenge to sovereignty which is inherent in the EU proposals, in the EU mandate. We wanted to see a strong commitment to the ratification of Paris. We wanted to see a ban on seabed mining. We wanted to see out blanket sanctions and the use of more targeted sanctions. We wanted to see out the Singapore issues, investment, competition, public procurement, TRIPS Plus, and being specific that it's the liberalisation of those concepts that's the problem. On trade arrangements, we discussed this quite a while because obviously in the Southern African region there are multiple different trade arrangements now at different levels of maturity with the EU. So we came up with that whatever the trade arrangements are under the post-Cotonou framework, they should be designed to serve and not undermine regional integration. In a dispute settlement process, a clear dispute settlement process as part of the agreement. And then we started to talk about the development cooperation aspects of it, and we got quite specific thinking about that we would want to see mainstreaming of gender budgeting included. And then we talked about farmers and agricultural production, and again under the development cooperation wanted to see support for agricultural producers and farmers to move towards a value addition and not just as suppliers of commodities. Then moving on to civil society engagement in the whole process, the point was made that some countries have automatic application of treaties, so there isn't necessarily a mechanism for parliamentary or civil society discussion of that treaty, whereas other countries don't have that automatic application, so there is necessarily a wider process of consultation and discussion. We discussed the responsibility on civil society to be more inclusive and engage citizens more directly. That's one of the lessons that has been learned from the last 20 years. We discussed the possibility of a binding MOU that, on the ACP to formalise civil society engagement. And we also discussed the need for transparency on who was being engaged at the civil society level, because it's very possible to claim to have engaged civil society but to have engaged the civil society that suits your purposes. So we felt transparency was important there.
The issue of technical and financial assistance should come out clearly. We also think that instead of having one omnibus SCP agreement which is binding, we should look on separate issues. If it is a trading arrangement, we should scope out a trading arrangement. If it is an investment arrangement, we should scope it out, and then we can discuss on what modalities, other than having one broad agreement. The issue of technical and financial assistance should come out clearly. We also think that instead of having one omnibus SCP agreement, which is binding, we should look on separate issues. If it is a trading arrangement, we should scope out a trading arrangement. If it is an investment arrangement, we should scope it out, and then we can discuss on what modalities other than having one broad agreement. We propose mechanisms that should include meetings with consultations and meetings with relevant stakeholders. We should go beyond technical. We should invest a lot in informal consultative meetings with the trade unions and the farmers, SMEs, to explain to them in the language that they understand.
On the first question, a shared relationship built on equity that contribute to our own economic, political, and development needs. We also felt that the issue of agriculture should be done away with in terms of Europe granting subsidy to their agricultural sector, and then they want us to liberalize ours. The Singapore issues, we are all conversant with it. We felt it should also be clearly stated where there is need for that under the EPA, and that our view is that it has to be captured under the EPA agreement, and then we have to get that understanding in terms of what those issues are, issues of government procurement, competition, intellectual property, investment, capital account, and liberalization. And so we also said we don't need any kind of condition attached to aid for development, where every time that support is being given, there is always an attachment to that. And we also said we don't want any political sanction or market access for our businesses under this agreement. Development is development. When it comes to business, there should be no sanction where there is a default by our state parties or a member state in that event. We want an independent space in our policy articulations. We don't want Europe to unduly monitor or influence our decision process tied to this agreement. We should be allowed to draft our own agenda and follow it through. We are more emphatic on promoting and ensuring that our regional integration process is strengthened. The issue of climate change. And then there is something unique we also try to look at in line of Article 11, 11A, and 11B of the present Cotonou Partnership Agreement that deals with small and light weapons and weapons of mass destruction. We don't know, but we are calling on this forum to give a right word to it. Whether we call it arms manufacturing article or clause, we don't know how to capture it, but the brain behind it is this. In this article, we talk about conflict management, fragile state, small and light weapons, terrorism, and the rest of it. And EU expects that we are always in conflict, or believe we are always in conflict, no doubt. But at the same time, we are suggesting, or we are trying to simulate that it has come to our knowledge, and very consciously too, that in all the fight that happened in Africa, in West Africa particularly, the arms and ammunition used are made in France. And so, how do we have a relationship? We want to avoid conflict, we want to build peace. But at the same time, parties to this process are manufacturers of arms that we use in fighting and killing ourselves, and then they come in to give us aid. So we should have a provision that makes it very clear from 2020, if there is a conflict in Ghana and we find out that the ammunition or the bullets is made in Germany, Germany will be held responsible. We should couch it somewhere along the line so that people don't make money out of our lives.